Now, a medical technique allowing parents with rare genetic mutations to have healthy babies could be given the go-ahead by Britain's fertility regulator. The idea of so-called three-parent babies has been met with some controversy, though, as it would alter the DNA of an embryo that could be passed on to future generations. Well, joining us to discuss this are Sarah Norcross from the Progress Educational Trust and also Roger Kiska, who's here in the studio and is from Christian Concern. Thank you both very much for being with us today. Sarah, perhaps I can ask you first, if you could just talk through this treatment, because it sounds quite complicated. Just explain what it is.
It is complicated, but simply put, what it is using the mitochondria from a donated egg and using the nuclear material, so the pronuclei from the parents of the child, so from the mum and dad, and putting those together to create children that will then not carry these inherited mitochondrial diseases. The mitochondrial diseases come down the mother's line, and so that's why the aim is to not to use the mother's mitochondria, but to use that of the donor.
So, Roger, this sounds like a good idea. It means that babies are going to be born healthy rather than having issues which can now be prevented.
Well, that's not entirely true, and that's the reason why there's so much opposition to this. So there is a real question of why is the UK the only one at the table? It's not because they got to this first, it's because everyone else has walked away. Why has the US FDA taken the unprecedented step of writing a letter to the UK authorities saying this is unsafe science? Why has the European Parliament said you've breached the clinical trials directives and not followed through on the proper procedure? So these are questions we have to ask. Why are we rushing this through? There's high risk of cancer. There's high risk of genetic defects. The reagents used in the procedure are highly toxic. So these are serious questions that need to be asked.
Sarah, it's dodgy science. That's what we're hearing.
That's simply not true. I can't think of any other area of medicine that's been subject to such scrutiny. The government and the regulator, the Human Fertilised Embryology Authority, have commissioned 4 scientific reviews of this. There's been parliamentary debates in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. There's been thoroughgoing public consultation on this, and the decision was made by our Parliament to allow this, subject to the regulator continuing to provide scrutiny of it, which is what they're doing.
We've had some tweets in on this, actually, Roger, and one from a viewer who said, well, plain and simple, it's just wrong. Regardless of whether it's dodgy science or not, it's just wrong. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, there are certainly eugenic aspects to this. There is the first time, I believe, in history that we are legally allowing the modification of the germline. So there are serious ethical issues. How far do we have to push this border down the line before we say enough is enough? We all remember Dolly the sheep and the fanfare that came with that. Well, Dolly lived a poor life and died young, and this procedure is hereditary. So when you're passing this down the line, who knows what this effect will have on future generations? We don't know. We're using British citizens as guinea pigs in this sense.
You see, Sarah, what many people will say is that this does go against nature, doesn't it? It's going against what nature perhaps intended.
So many areas of medicine go against nature: heart transplants, lung transplants, treatment for cancer. You know, I think that's sort of a poor argument to go down. What we're talking about here is research that has been slowly developing over time. I first started getting involved in the campaign to allow these treatments to be available to people 9 years ago. And I wasn't there at the very beginning. This is something that has been a long and slow process. It's not been a rush by any stretch of the imagination. And what we're looking at happening today is for the regulator to say, yes, they're open for business to accept licence applications from clinics. Clinics then have to be granted a licence by the regulator. And then, even then, they can't treat people just who turn up at the door. What they then have to do is to apply to the regulator on a case-by-case basis to get permission to treat them. So this is going to be very carefully scrutinised to make because what no one wants to do, the scientists, the doctors involved in this, they do not want to create a problem. What they are looking to do is to create a solution for people whose families are blighted by these conditions.
So Sarah Norcross is saying this isn't an overnight thing. It's something she's been campaigning on for almost a decade. It's something that doctors and scientists have been looking into for many, many years. You must see that point of view, that you know, no one's going to rush into something that is so complex.
I think they already have rushed into it. I mean...
But she says she's been for 10 years...
From the UK perspective, but why did they abandon the clinical directive, the clinical trials directive at the EU level? Why are there so many members of European Parliament who are up in arms? Because, you know, A, the directive was applicable because of the reagents being used, and B, because of the germline being modified. So this is being rushed through. Why not wait and go through the EU process, which UK is legally bound to do?
So could you envisage a day when actually you would support this then? If it goes through everything you want it to go through, could you eventually support it?
I could not, simply because the eugenic aspect of this, it's too high. There's parental issues. When you have 3 parents for a single child, there's legal questions, there's moral questions. There's just so much wrong with this, fundamentally, that it just doesn't work. The benefit doesn't outweigh the cost.
Sarah, can you answer that? 3 parents for a single child, and can you guarantee that baby, which is the most important thing, is going to live a full, healthy life because of this medical intervention?
Well, to deal with the 3-parent issue first, the law is very clear in the UK about who the parents of that child are, and that is the mum and the dad who are bringing it up, and not the egg donor. Okay, so there are not 3 parents. It's wrong to call it that, and it sets the wrong. It frames it
there are 3
the
parents.
wrong way from the beginning.
Roger's saying biologically,
yes.
Sarah, there are 3 parents. Biologically.
Yes, biologically there are 3 people involved. It takes a lot more than biology to be a parent. If a woman has a one-night stand, then, you know, and the man has disappeared from that life, we don't always go on about him there, and the child doesn't grow up thinking he's a parent because he's not been involved in that child's life. You know, it's the people who are there to change the nappies, to pick them up from school, to, you know, look after them when they're sick, that are the parents. And in relation to the safety elements, you know, this is as safe as it can be, as far as we know. And there always has to be a leap when you move from the bench to the bedside. So when you go from science into the hospital.
That leap is making the individual a guinea pig, unfortunately. That leap was made with thalidomide back in the day and all the birth defects. That was a miracle drug to cure anxiety. And look at what the result was. That leap is too far, a bridge too far.
The baby's not safe, you think?
I don't think. I think science says that the testing on primates has said that the baby's not safe.
Sorry, Sarah Norcross, just briefly, come back in.
Well, you know, the health and safety issue has been considered in great detail by the Science Review panel here, and they have put in checks and balances that they want to see to minimise any possible chance of risk. There is always a chance of risk, but then this is now down to the patients in consultation with their clinician, with genetic counsellors, to decide whether this treatment is suitable for them. No one is forcing them to have this treatment. It's entirely up to them. And when you start talking about eugenics, it makes you think of, masses and masses of people doing this. In the UK, it's estimated that we'll probably be treating about 25 people a year. That is not some mass eugenic movement.
Okay.
It's still a eugenic movement. Whether it's one person or a million people, it's still a eugenic movement.
OK, we must leave it there, but thank you both very much. Sarah Norcross from the Progress Educational Trust and Roger Kiska from Christian Concern. Thank you.
Thank you.